welcome everybody, those that are watching at home and maybe even across the ocean. We don't know. I mean, the World Wide Web is a big place, so anything is possible. And that's actually why we're coming to everybody tonight with an interesting topic, but one that we feel is very valuable to everybody because it happens every so often, but it changes so much that we feel that we need to address some of those changes and what we're kind of looking at going into 2022 midterms and beyond, that anything really is possible. And so I'm going to kick it over to my very faithful and dedicated co-host here tonight, Dallas, who's been so dedicated with the club, and I'm very appreciative of. And we're going to go ahead and kick this thing off. So Dallas, what you got for us?
Yeah, well, so as you were saying, Joe, and hello, everybody. Good evening or whatever time it is that you're watching or listening to this. So we're talking about the 2022 midterms, which are Joe Biden's first midterm, maybe his last as president, one can hope. And so what I want to kind of talk about real quick is, I want to do a little bit of level setting. There's, I don't want to say misinformation, but I think there's a lot of really biased information when it comes to election coverage. The mainstream media has a tendency to always try to portray Republicans as struggling upwards, or they'll say, "Oh, this is a really difficult map for Republicans." I kind of want to address this evening, as you and I are chatting, some of those things. But I think the best way to get an understanding of midterms and how they work is just to go back in time real quick to really what we can understand is the first modern midterm, which is 1994, which is essentially when history started, because that's when I was born. That's a joke. I'm not that conceited. But in 1994, Republicans win the House of Representatives for the first time in 50 years. 50 years. And that's why it's really the start of the modern midterm, because it's the first midterm where we see that both parties are competitive in Congress, which really hadn't been a thing since 1952, which is mind-blowing. And what's happened since 1994 is every few years, the parties change. Change majorities. Neither party has been able to establish a long-term majority in the Senate or the House since 1994. It changes. So 1994, Republicans win the majority in the House, and then they lose it in 2006. It gets real close before that. 2002 is one of the few midterm elections in history where the president's party, George W. Bush's Republicans, gains a couple seats in the House in 2002. And this is primarily because of 9/11. It sounds weird to say, but Republicans were seen as stronger on national defense than Democrats were. Democrats had a hard time getting a message about national security in the early 2000s. They really couldn't find their footing, and Republicans just played their cards really well. And it's the last time that the president's party in a midterm doesn't lose seats. It's been 20 years since the president's party didn't lose seats in the House. 2006, Democrats annihilate Republicans in the House and the Senate. It is a blue wave. But then just 4 years later, we have the biggest wave election in generations. 2010, it's the year of the Tea Party. I always tell people, and I'm an unreformed Tea Party guy, and the Tea Party exceeds all expectations, 2010. And then once again, of course, 8 years later, the Democrats come back in 2018, and they win back the House. And they chip away at the Republican Senate majority. And now here we are with a 50-50 Senate, and as close to 50-50 just about as you can get in the House of Representatives. The Democrats have, kind of depending on what day of the week you're counting, maybe a 6-seat majority. And that number does change. We recently had Congressman Young in Alaska who passed away. He was a Republican. So the Democrats' majority slightly increased technically. But it's so small, at 435 people, those 5 or 6 seats barely matter. It's basically a tie. And so in 2022, we basically have a tie in both houses, and that's really what's at stake here. Is where history suggests this should be a good year for Republicans, and it's already really close. And so, actually, tell us a little bit, Thomas. I know you work in this world. You're a professional in this world. So, what's the temperature when it comes?
Well, and I want to pinpoint something that Dallas has sort of outlined here, and it's very interesting. You know, we always talk about politics as a pendulum, right? Well, what happens in this instance is that there's a pendulum, but it's starting to come to the center, right? And so we're seeing that a lot, where you might have a 6-vote swing, but it really is inconsequential. It really is, because
you mean 6 votes in the House, not the Senate.
Yeah, that's what to be clear, right? Somebody is really inconsequential because somebody could sneeze wrong and change the vote. You know? It feels like that some days. It really does. And
we've seen 2 Democrats recently who changed their parties. The gentleman in New Jersey, and then one here in Texas, South Texas.
Right. That's right. And so I feel personally that this is actually good governance, right? This is how it's supposed to be. There's supposed to be discourse, a little tug and pull. A little, you know, eventually it all kind of self-corrects in a way, but that's why it's so much more important as we get closer to these midterms in 2024. So as Dallas alluded to, the suburbs are vitally important, and the reason these are so important because these are what I would call bread on the table voters. These are the people that they care about their potholes and the property taxes. These are the people that really, really care about the nuts and bolts of their lives. And so they're going to listen to representatives and people that are running that care about those also. And so the suburbs matter because they also change, and they don't change necessarily with the news cycle. They sometimes often actually go, they can not necessarily go against, but they will conflict with what the news is saying is important to voters. And so we have to really pay attention to what these people are saying that they need help with. Again, the job of a legislator is to help with those problems. And so, again, we have to look on all 3 levels of government, right? You have city, you have local, right? And you have state, and then you have federal. So we have to ask the question for these bread on the table voters, for these voters that, you know, they really care about their kids going to good schools, the property taxes being low. What can the federal level do? What can some of the governors do? Those are the big questions, because the further you get up, the broader the legislation gets, because you're dealing with more people. The lower down you go, the more detailed or more refined, but then you don't help because you're helping a smaller subset of people. So that's how that balance works. So then we have to ask that question again. So now we know that that's the framework. What can some of these senators do? What can some of these governors do? What can some of these members do on a broader level to listen more to the suburbs? I think it's all within the grassroots. I think really what's going to change a lot of the election between 2022 and 2024, again, the midterms that we're talking about tonight, is the grassroots effort candidates put into it. If they go and listen and go and hear, they actually hear what people are saying, I think they're going to be quite surprised, because you and I have both blocked from different candidates. And oftentimes the media will say that, just like what you mentioned in the beginning, they will mention one thing and something else is going on. And when you get down to the suburbs and the single family home neighborhoods, and you talk to these folks, there are things that matter to them that are completely different than what we're told. And so the reason they matter is because they change a lot. And here's one of the reasons, and I want to dig into this for just a minute. The reason they change is because the cycle of a family changes. So you have a couple, then they grow into a family, and that family might mean they get a dog, right? But that changes what they care about, right? Then they have a child or 2 or 3 or 4 or however many they are comfortable with, and then kids go off to grade school, then high school, and college. Eventually, then you have no kids at home, and then you're retiring. There's job cycles that are in there. You're going to have a teenager that has a job, a teenager that gets a learning permit. You're going to Yet the average person spends only 4 years in a job. So then you're going to have a husband and a wife, if they're both working, changing jobs. Maybe somebody's going to college while they're working. So the reason they're so important is because not only do they change so much, but they change very individually. And not only do they change very individually, they change frequently because their life is growing and developing. And so I think, again, what's really going to impact the vote count at the end of the day for these elections is people getting on the ground and listening right now, what is important to you. Because the reason that's important is because what right now is important to them wasn't important to them in 2020. Wasn't important to them necessarily in 2019 or before. And this is the crux of this entire discussion, that what is going on now that's important is way different. And Dallas is going to get to how it's winnable for Republicans and how things have changed here in a minute. But we're talking about that the suburbs are so important because of the changes in life that these folks go through.
And if I can just interject one quick thing, because you make a really good point that the suburbs are always changing. I think one of those reasons there's in some ways the suburbs are kind of a thermometer for how the country is doing, because suburbs can grow or shrink. They grow for a couple different reasons. People maybe start doing really well in the city, right? You have younger people who, like you said, they have kids. And generally speaking, people don't like to raise kids in dense urban environments. They like to have the idea of their kids running out and playing on the lawn. And so when you have a lot more kids, you tend to have a lot more people moving into the suburbs, or what some eggheads call the exurbs, right? The bigger, broader suburbs. But there's another reason that people move out to the suburbs, which is crime, or perceived disorder, or the city gets too expensive. And so, like you were saying, the voters in the suburbs, it's not just their lifestyle changes or where they are in life changes. The voters themselves change. New people move in because sometimes they're fleeing something. So often the suburbs are the refuge for independently minded voters. Somebody who says my small town I grew up in the central Ohio is just not enough economic opportunity for me. I'm moving to the Columbus suburbs. Or what we see a lot of in New York right now, right, is it's too expensive. It's getting crazy. We've got people shooting people in the subway, and I still need to work in New York, but I don't need to live here. So I'm going to move out of state next door to New Jersey. And you see those districts change. And generally speaking, when you see somebody leaving a city, the reason they're leaving it is because the city's been governed really badly by progressives, and it tends to make the suburbs better environment for conservatives.
Well, and so just to delineate here, we have lifestyle changes and growing, and then we have environmental change, right? That's what Dallas outlined. And so taking, for instance, let's say Austin, he used New York as an example, but Austin, the very dense core, it's changing, but not as much, right? If you live in one of those high rises, the likelihood of all those high rises around you being the same, at least 3-4 years from now, is relatively high compared to when you live in the suburbs. And so there's this consistency in both, right? When you live in a dense area, there's consistency in crime. There's consistency in crime of all, theft and whatever. Consistency in environment to a certain extent. They call it a concrete jungle for a reason. There's a consistency there, but it's not necessarily peaceful all the time. In fact, I would argue it's most of the time not peaceful. And so that would be maybe better for a younger person. But when you're ready to develop a family and grow a family in your life, further from that environment, you look for the yard, you look for the house you can paint, you look for the wall you can knock down, right? You look for that. It's like, okay, I'm ready to put down roots, and it's not necessarily in this dense area. And so you have those two components which create a change in voter base. And we saw that in the in New York, New Jersey, in the council races, where some of those districts really changed, really changed, and we got some conservative, but they labeled themselves as GOP candidates into that New York City Council. So those are two very important components to the suburbs and voters in general. You know, you're going to have a very specific type of person downtown, but the person in the suburbs is going to change. And if that person grows a family in, let's say, a single family home, in, let's say, Circle C in Austin, and they love the space, and then they want land, they're taking off.
Right, they got to go even further out.
Exactly. So it's following that voter along the path that, you know, and then that, you know, that can give us advantages or disadvantages, but typically people move out to the suburbs because of bad liberal policies, for sure. Yeah. So that leads us now into checking my notes here. Oh yeah, the structure. So let's talk about the structure, right? So let's talk about the structure of you know, the House and the Senate and the governors. And you wanted to give sort of an overview, if people didn't know, kind of how that structure works.
Yeah. So for those who are watching, I'm going to share my screen real quick. You're going to see a couple of maps show up on the screen. Thomas, you see those maps?
All good.
Okay, good. So we've got, obviously the House of Representatives is up every 2 years, the whole House. And then we have kind of a random smattering of governors, and then 1/3-ish of senators are up for re-election or election, most of them re-election, every midterm. And so, for example, Texas has our governor up, but not either of our senators. And so this kind of creates this weird environment where you have people who won their election in a very different space. They won their first election, or they're in a very different space than the current environment. In a way, particularly with senators, because they have 6 years in between, that pretty much nobody else has to experience. And it can lead to really odd races. So you have, for example, Senator Ron Johnson, who I know we're going to get to, but just as an example real quick, he's won election twice. Both times everybody's saying he doesn't stand a chance. And both times that guy just sails through. And I'll note that this time we don't hear those, well, he doesn't stand a chance. This time it's like, well, we'll see if the Democrats have somebody to put up against him. So one of the structural things that's odd here, though, is that basically people don't split their votes anymore, right? They don't vote for a senator of a different party than they vote for president. But what they do is when it comes to the governors, and for those who aren't watching but are listening to this, I'm gesturing to the governor's map. They are willing to some degree to split their vote when it comes to governors. It's a very, very odd quirk of Americans. I think part of it is there is a sense of this is my home, and our issues are different here than across the whole country. And people kind of understand the senators go to DC, they're dealing with the whole country's issues, but my governor's dealing with issues in my backyard. So for example, Vermont, Bernie Sanders' home state, has a Republican governor, and it's not going to be a particularly close election. The Republicans are almost certainly going to win, once again, the governor's seat of Vermont. It's really weird, but that's been the case. Maryland, for the longest time, has had a Republican governor. He's finally resigned. He's not running for re-election, so probably going to go to a Democrat, probably. But Kansas is a toss-up when it comes to the governor's election, despite the fact that Trump won it by like 20 points in 2016 and 2020. It's not a competitive state at any level but the governor's races. Now, thankfully here in Texas, we're a little odd in that Texas tends to vote more closely at the presidential level and the senatorial level than at the governor's level. So there's a lot of Democrats here who, when it comes to president and Senate and House, vote hardcore Democrat, but every 4 years they pull the lever for the governors, for the Republican running for governor. So like in 2018, Ted Cruz beat Beto by just under 3 points. You know, it's like 2.5 points, something like that.
Yep.
But Greg Abbott won by 10 points. And that's kind of been a pattern that we see repeated. And so even though, you know, every couple of years you hear Democrats talk about, we're going to turn Texas blue, they pretty much never talk about that at the governor's race, except for that one time with Wendy Davis when they were all high on something, convincing themselves that she was going to beat Greg Abbott. I don't know how they got there, but so that's just kind of a quick breakdown of Senate versus governors. And then one other point, and we'll toss it back to you, Thomas, is that, you know, when I was kind of giving the brief history of these elections, we're talking about in 1994, 2010, 60 seats changing in the House of Representatives from Democrat to Republican, or in 2018, like 40 seats changing from Democrat to, or from Republican to Democrat. There's just not that many seats anymore that are up, not for re-election, but that are competitive. You know, you can blame it on gerrymandering, but it's a sin of both parties. And if you want to get frank about it, I don't think it's particularly sinful. And people move. As Americans, we're nomadic. We like to live near people who think like us, who talk like us, who act like us. And you just have fewer and fewer districts that are competitive. You have a lot more districts that are Democrat plus 20 or Republican plus 15 than you pretty much ever have. Now, it's very possible that we're going to head into an enormous wave election. We'll talk about that a little bit at the end of just how big this thing could be. But one of the things is, while we're talking about all these great opportunities, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. I think the people who are watching have had a good enough idea of kind of the states that are up for contention. And we'll talk about some specific states for those who are just listening. So while we're talking about the great opportunities Republicans have here, I want to also temper expectations that there's enough seats to flip for Republicans to hold solid majorities, but you're not going to see a 2010 60 seat flip. Now, partially that's because the Democrats only have that 5 to 6 seat majority. It's not like they're way overextended like they were in 2010. But it's also because just a lot of the seats aren't as competitive as they used to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and let's go back to something that you said that I thought was very interesting before we get on to some of the states that we're going to highlight today. You know, this theme of this pendulum, right? It's kind of back and forth. A big part of that is because there is such an ebb and flow in society. You're right. People move into locations that they like the environment, like you mentioned earlier. They like the music, the food, the transportation, whatever, you know. Then they find people that they ideologically align with, and they find people that they religiously align with. And that flows because that changes. You know, if you live next to somebody that, you know, thinks the same way, but then that person moves on to have more property, or that person moves on because their kids move away from the home, and that person just moves on, you might find yourself feeling a little alone, and so you might move. And so there's all these factors, you know, people are multifaceted, but the point being is, I think we're at a point now, the reason we are somewhat coming more to a center on this, I think that why some of those seats aren't near as competitive as they used to be is because of that factor. There's been more of a mixing. People trying to find where they fit. We're also in the middle of a generational change. You're having people growing up and young folks leaving college and then making their own way. We're in this kind of transition. The big overarching question, though, that might be in the minds of people listening, though, is that what do we do to sustain a swing, right? And I think that's the age-old political science question. It's like when we have the chance to take over a majority, how do we do it the next time? How do you keep it? How do you keep it from swinging again, right? And we can touch on that near the end and leave everybody with that. But I have a few thoughts on it. But I think that variety of environment, you know, think about technology. technology is changing in every environment that we're living in right now. Everything from transportation to technology to finance to small business, all of that's changing the environments that we live in. Then ideologically, stuff is changing and changing itself. Religion is changing. Ways of doing business is changing. People can start a small business on their laptop and do business in Singapore if they want to, right? It's just everything's so different now that we're having that integration, and that makes for a very interesting voting base.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and get to some states. We have a few picked out that are very interesting to watch. I'm excited to watch some of them. I have resources that I'm going to drop in the description below the video where you can go and look, I mean, in like granular detail, different states and some states that we have not mentioned here. And you can look at all sorts of great graphs and everything like that. And we're working off those resources, but I will drop those in the description. But I guess not in alphabetical order, but Dallas is going to start with one that does start with an A.
Yes, Alaska. Actually, I think we do have them accidentally arranged in alphabetical order. Wasn't my intention, but there they are. I'm looking at the list right now.
Oh, are they? Okay.
Yep, they are in alphabetical order.
Well, except for maybe.
Nope,
close, very close.
Oh, no, they're at the end. Yeah, I see it.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, the W.
So the first state I want to talk about is, and the reason I want to talk about it is it's so dang weird, is the Alaska election in general.
Yeah,
so Alaska.
Before you dig into it, it's been kind of strange for a while.
Alaska? So
just in general.
It's an odd state. You know, it has the largest native population, which we don't get to see, or as a proportion of the voting base, I should say. And so, you know, they have issues that matter to the Inuit tribes, have issues that matter to them that most other voters aren't thinking about, which is right off the top makes it a little bit more odd. Alaska is a state that, interestingly enough, when it was created, was intended to be a Democratic state, and has always been a solid Republican state. And at the same time, Hawaii was created to be a Republican state, and it's always been a Democratic state. So already the people, when these states were first being introduced, nobody actually knew what the heck was going on. And sometimes we're still trying to figure it out, because they've had some Alaska's had some odd senators. If you want to see something really odd, everybody who's listening, just look up Mike Gravel Rock. It is the strangest political ad you will ever see. The guy's a weirdo. Seems like a nice gentleman, though. So anyhow, what's going on in Alaska? Well, they're having a Senate election. They're having a gubernatorial election. And they're having an at-large House of Representatives election. So Alaska has one House rep because even though it is an enormous state, it's very sparsely populated. So they only have one rep. And that representative, as we'd mentioned earlier, Representative Young, had passed away. He had been in that seat for 50 years, I want to say, something along those lines. Very old school Republican, kind of, you know, he was a wheeler and dealer. Very much, what can I bring home to Alaska? Not ideological at all. And so Alaska has this really weird primary system. That it's a jungle primary, as it's called. So there are no party primaries. Everybody runs in the same thing, and then the top 4 vote getters move on to the general election, and then they move into ranked choice voting. So so everybody votes, that you list who your third favorite person is, your second favorite person is, and who your favorite person is. And then they go through and they say, okay, who had the fewest favorite votes? And they just knock that person out. And then they say who had then they look at everybody's next tier. And it's very odd. It makes it really difficult to predict how this is going to go down. And so even though Alaska is a really Republican state, I mean, it was Trump plus 15 thereabouts. You're going to wind up with some weird results from this. And it's made even weirder by the fact that we're going to have a special election to replace Representative Young this summer. Let me pull up that date real quick because I have it here. That's going to happen in June. And then we're going to have a primary for the general election that happens in November.
Right.
So then the primary for the special election happens in May. Oh, so it's really weird. It gets even weirder. So everybody's listening, keeping track of this. What gets even weirder is that the special election to decide who will be their new representative is on the same day as the primary for the general election in November, which means you could theoretically have the person who wins and becomes the representative lose the primary. So they're only going to be representative for 8 months. It's very strange.
Just strange, or translation kind of confusing, right?
Yes,
I mean,
but it gets weirder.
Yeah.
Because there are 48 people running for this seat.
Oh, perfect.
48. And that's
Perfect.
not an exaggeration. There were 50, but 2 failed to properly fill out their paperwork.
Oh, darn. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And it's not like, so a lot of people might have heard about this because Sarah Palin announced that she was running for this seat. She's the former governor. She's not a shoo-in. There's still a lot of bad blood toward her because she resigned unexpectedly. And a lot of people feel like she's a quitter. So it's going to be weird. It's going to be weird. And it's made weirder. Alaska gets weirder still because they have Senator Murkowski. She's running for re-election. Yeah. And a lot of people don't know this about Murkowski. She did not win her own party's primary in 2010.
Did she not?
She lost the Republican primary and then won as a write-in candidate.
Oh, nice. Okay. Wow.
So she's not even well loved by her home state Republican Party. Right. She wins consistently by cobbling together a weird coalition of independents.
A weird coalition.
A weird coalition of independents, of center Democrats, and center Republicans. And she squeaks by every time. She's going to be in hot water this time. This is a real one of the few primaries that we should actually be watching as being competitive. There's going to be other primaries, but this is one of the few incumbents who could actually lose her seat in a primary. Now, of course, she survived that before, but she has not been endorsed by Donald Trump. Ms. Shibaka, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it, who served as a Donald Trump appointee, has his endorsement. She's much more conservative than Murkowski, and I get very frustrated with Murkowski because as I was telling Thomas earlier, she's a wasted vote. Yes. Alaska is very, very, very conservative, but Murkowski is about as center as a Republican as you can get. She votes very, very center. And so very similar to Susan Collins over in Maine, but Susan Collins is a centrist in a blue state. She's a vote we should never have gotten anyway. And so anytime that she just happens to vote with us, it's like, oh yay, we got that vote. But Murkowski's a vote we lose. It's like, come on. It's a state we could be more aggressive in. Yeah. So I know everybody who's listening, their head is spinning. And it's because Alaska's bizarre. They've set up this bizarre system. Your thoughts, Thomas?
Yeah, so no, I think it's interesting. I mean, thoughts are this is that it makes you pay attention, right? So we're used to sort of, in Texas, we're used to sort of pretty clean, unless there is a special, pretty clean elections, right? I think this is weird all around from its inception.
Yep.
Right? You have indigenous people, you have the Sarah Palin stuff. You have all the recipes, and then you have the way everything is timed to make it even more confusing. And I'm going to use that word from a voter standpoint.
It's confusing. Yeah.
So, I think it's going to be interesting. I guess the big question everybody wants to know is, like, are we going to lose it? Right. And I guess the answer to that is no, because it is a conservative state.
We could lose the House seat. You could see a center Democrat being a majority of people's number 2 pick.
Because of ranked choice. So that's
because of ranked choice.
Yeah. So with ranked choice, that's very interesting. So, in Texas, it's a debated subject. I'm not going to get into ranked choice. It's not what this is about. But do you think and then I'll give my thoughts. Do you think in a state like Alaska, ranked choice is a good thing?
So good thing from a governance standpoint or a party standpoint?
From a voting standpoint.
From a voting standpoint, I would say, in the case of Alaska, yes.
I agree.
Because Alaska does have these odd coalitions that do. It is a state that, even though it's very conservative, and oddly enough, basically the economy thrives on oil, has a lot of environmental concerns.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Well, yeah, it's a beautiful country. And so it's interesting. So the way I've always heard people kind of talk about Alaska and Hawaii, actually, is that they're kind of their own countries, but they're also states. They feel like countries because of the disconnect from just the land alone. We don't hear a lot about out of Alaska. You hear stuff out of, or especially recently, Florida, and obviously Texas with some of the bills we're passing. But Alaska, Hawaii, kind of remain kind of in their own universe. I think ranked choice is you need it when it's in that kind of closed environment. I think it needs to be regulated a little bit more, or not regulated, monitored a little bit. Whole different subject. It's an odd thing, but in this particular case that we're running into this time, it could make actually things a little bit more complicated, depending on how things. But it'll be really fun to watch. Really fun to watch.
And this is when the people are going, what? These two are so weird that they think this is going to be fun. Actually, it's interesting. You make a note. You make a note about Alaska and Hawaii's similarities in their strangeness, because each one of those states has a politician that is well known, and in both cases, interestingly enough, they're Gen X women. And in both cases, they are total iconoclasts. You love them or you hate them.
Right.
And I'm talking, of course, about Sarah Palin from Alaska. And can you guess Hawaii?
I think I know who it is. But go ahead.
Tulsi Gabbard.
Okay, that's not who I thought you were going to say. But
okay.
But that she is a subject within herself.
Exactly. As is Sarah Palin.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting, these two states that are, compared to everything else, the lower 48, are alien. These two states, the most well-known politicians are not. They're not particularly well loved, but they are talked about a lot. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, Tulsi's. I won't. Yeah, I mean.
We won't get into it because that's a whole hours-long conversation.
There's a whole other thing, but. Yes, they are kind of autonomous on their own. They're kind of these, no pun intended, kind of floating out there. So no, I thought you were referring to a. Now the names escape me. Senator. What's her name?
Oh, from Hawaii.
Yeah.
Hirano. Oh, geez.
That's it.
Mazie Hirano. Nope.
Yeah, I watched a lot of hearings with her. Very interesting to watch. Now, and let's be clear, when we say interesting, it's purely from an academic standpoint, right? So when we're watching this stuff and say, oh, this is gonna be interesting, we're watching it to learn. We don't have to necessarily agree with any of these.
Right.
But Hirano, that's it. Yes.
Hirano.
She is just watching some of those hearings are insane. So
she's not a good senator. She's not good at her job.
Again, another topic. So we have more states to get to.
Yes. Some, and these are all going to be focused around the Senate.
Yes.
So I talked for a while about Alaska. I think it's fascinating. I think it's really interesting, and I think there's going to be a lot of misinformation or misunderstandings about what's going on in Alaska.
Well, that's to be expected, considering. With these other ones, we'll kind of breeze through them a little bit. I mean, I don't have any massive commentary on all of them, just kind of who's kind of running and who to kind of watch out for. But it looks like you have Arizona, Georgia, Nevada.
Yeah, so it's interesting. We're kind of watching the swing states shift from the Midwest to the Sun Belt. Now, of course, there's still Ohio and Pennsylvania are going to be up for election, and theoretically, Pennsylvania could be close, but pretty much nobody's talking about Ohio as a competitive state anymore. It's a Republican state now, which is amazing because it was the swing state for 2 generations, 3 generations.
Decades. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yep. So what we see is Arizona, we have Mark Kelly, the Democrat, running for re-election for his first full term. He won a special election previously. And Mark Kelly is an odd guy. He's a Democrat. And for the longest time, he was a very...
That's not together. Does it mean...
Oh.
Or does it?
Well, what I was going to say is that he's odd in that he was a conventional Democrat up until about 9 minutes ago.
Oh, gotcha.
And then suddenly it's like he leaned over and was looking at Kyrsten Sinema's notes and went, okay, start taking stronger stance on the border, start being more independent, cut taxes, because all of a sudden he's been all over the news talking about being very openly critical of the Biden administration.
Yeah.
And so that's going to be a harder seat. Arizona used to be a deep red, cherry red state. And in the space of just a few years, it's become extremely competitive, and now has 2 Democratic senators. And the Republican Party is in total chaos. It's partly due to still the after effects of John McCain's death. John McCain ran the party in that state for the longest time, and there was no heir apparent. And so there's very much a hardcore pro-Trump wing and very much a moderate pro-McCain wing, if you will. And they are at war with each other, and the Democrats are making hay. It's going to be really hard for any Republican nominee, Senate nominee there to unite the party, because it's getting really ugly. And actually, just before we jumped on, I saw that Donald Trump has announced he will be releasing an endorsement in that state. He hasn't said who it will be for. It's not going to be for the polling leader, the guy who's up front right now, who's their attorney general, because Donald Trump blames him for the loss of Arizona in 2020. So Arizona is going to be, it's definitely still in contention, because in a wave year, you can overcome party divisions really easily because the independents swing to one party or the other. So Mark Kelly is in bad shape. But even if Republicans lose, we've forced him to come to our side on a lot of issues now, where he wasn't a year ago. So that's great to see.
Yeah, the 2020 election kind of shook things up, and that's kind of what a lot of this is actually, really, honestly, folks. We're dealing a lot with the after effects of that. I mean, you can see it. Arizona, I remember forever, was a deep red state. And coming out of 2019 and 2020 and 2021, as we slide into these midterms, it's not that anymore at all. Yeah,
and it's not particularly blue. I mean, Donald Trump only lost by 11,000 votes, 12,000 votes. Mark Kelly won by less than 0.5%. Kyrsten Sinema won by less than 0.5%. It's a really close state. But the Republican Party is so at war with itself, it's not in a position to capitalize.
Yeah, and that's almost as being. I mean, it's not blue, it's purple, but it might as well. I mean, we're handing them a lot of stuff that we shouldn't be doing. But
it's our version. It's our version of Florida. Florida is always close, and Republicans always win.
Yeah, there you go. That's a good way to put it. Yeah,
and so what's happening now is Arizona is going to always be close, but it looks like Democrats are going to keep pulling out the wins. It's also interesting that the last 4 senators that Arizona's had, Kelly, Sinema, McCain, Flake, have all been renowned for bucking their party. All 4 senators, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. So there's a real independent streak in Arizona. I wouldn't sleep on it, but I don't think it's very favorable to us. And speaking of states that are shook up by 2020, Georgia. Yet again, another state that used to be cherry red, and now it's kind of got a purple tinge to it. And I think Georgia's very odd. It had those special elections, those runoff elections in January 2020, 2021, sorry. And so it was this fallout of the 2020 election because no candidate got 50% of the vote, so it had to move to a runoff. And there was a lot of anger and a lot of depression on the part of Republicans. And Democrats won both of the elections for the Senate by the skin of their teeth, but they won. And we can throw blame if we want, but that's not what we're here to do. What we're here to do is just talk about it. And so what we're looking at in those Senate elections, and we're just going to look at the Senate because there's a whole governor's election over there that's really, really intense and pretty ugly. Georgia's senator who's up for re-election is Raphael Warnock, who, like I said, he's been senator for less than a year. He's not particularly popular in Georgia. He's not particularly well aligned with Georgia voters. And so there's the race to replace him among Republicans is pretty much dominated by Herschel Walker. Herschel Walker is a former football player, probably a lot of people say the best college football star ever. He's actually a personal friend of Donald Trump's, but he's been a Republican for a long time. This is not a guy who just recently discovered a care for conservative politics. He's been a conservative for a long time. He's been a thoughtful guy for a long time. He's very charitable, but he's got a big problem. And that is what he's been very upfront about, very public about. Herschel Walker suffers from dissociative identity disorder and has a history of domestic violence. This is an illness. This is not for me to say that he's a bad man. I want to be very clear. By all accounts, he's a man of deep faith and compassion. But if you're voting for Senate, it does give you pause that you have to think, who am I voting for here? And so there's kind of this feeling, this worry that nobody can beat Herschel Walker in the primary for the Republicans because he's a freaking hero. But that he can't beat Raphael Warnock because in the general, you're going to have a lot of independents who don't know his story, who don't have that history of knowing how much he's contributed. And the mainstream media is going to take these domestic violence cases, which you can argue is fair, and say, illness or no, and they're gonna run that against them 24/7.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate, of course, but it's the nature of the game, right? I've been watching that one. Herschel a little bit on LinkedIn and stuff, and he's very transparent about it.
Yes,
I think that's smart politically, and I hate to say it that way, but I mean, if you're going to have something that's debilitating and that may hurt other people, you don't want the media to break that story. You
want to own it.
Yeah, and he's done a great job of doing that. He's very charitable, and with people that suffer some of the same illnesses that he does. So, so that's going to be really interesting to watch. I think we know how that one's going to probably shake out in the end.
It's probably going to go to. I think right now, if you put a gun to my head, I'd say Herschel Walker wins.
So has he received the Trump endorsement?
I don't know. I think I just assumed he had.
I haven't seen it.
That's a great question, but there's not really a competitor against him.
Yeah,
I mean, there is somebody who's running against him, but the polling is like 70% for Herschel Walker and 16% for the other guy.
And when I say shakeout, I mean the general, not the primary. Yeah,
I think still that Georgia would vote for Herschel Walker.
Okay, that's fair.
In the general.
Okay.
I think the environment is so pro-Republican right now. I mean, what we're looking at is Donald Trump.
There's a lot of residue.
Joe Biden has lost a quarter of black voters. 25% of black voters said they will not vote for a Democrat moving forward. Doesn't mean they're going to vote for a Republican. Just probably means they're going to stay home and not vote. He's lost a majority now of Latinos. And he's
a big swing.
And he's lost, this is the newest one, a majority of voters under 30.
Because
And so the Democratic coalition is built on young people and ethnic minorities. And if you don't have young people and ethnic minorities, you don't have a coalition. So The coalition, I think, is just falling apart. Like I said, I don't mean that Republicans are going to win 60% of eligible voters, but just Republicans are a lot more motivated to go out and vote, and Democrats aren't. And I think you gotta toss that one over to Herschel Walker, because he's done a really good job of uniting the party in the state behind him.
Well, it reminds me of Youngkin, right? I mean,
Yep.
it reminds me a lot of what happened, what we saw with
In Virginia.
The Virginia race with Glenn, because it wasn't about party, it was about issues. And this goes back to the very beginning of this discussion, where it's like when you drill down and talk to people in the neighborhoods, in the suburbs, you talk to them, you're going to find out that it's not really party as much as it is issues that both parties should be able to unite around. And so what tends to happen is, let's say it's lower property taxes or something, and you focus in on that, and somebody starts making it party, you start alienating yourself as a candidate, right? And that's exactly what happened with education, and that whole debacle when Youngkin's competitors said, well, X, Y, Z, and it's like everybody's like, I'm done. Like, and I don't want to get into it, it's real nasty and everything. But the point is that I think Georgia has a chance to position themselves very similarly to Virginia. And we're starting to see some of that happen. It's very interesting how the country's sort of divided between like the Arizona and the Nevadas and the Californias, and then you have over here where people are really paying attention to the bread on the table issues. So speaking of that, and I want to be respectful of time, so we could do probably 2 hours, and maybe we'll do another one of these. But you had another one, I had a couple. We can either go through those, or I can pick a few, or however you want to do it.
I'll just say the last one real quick. Nevada is up for election. It's Adam Laxalt is the Republican, and he's going up against Cortez Masto, who's not particularly popular in her state. And Nevada is a state that has elected Republicans in the past. It's always close. It can go either way, and it's an impossibly difficult state to poll. So whatever poll numbers you see, take them with not just a grain of salt, but the whole shaker, because it's infamously bad. They'll say Joe Biden's going to win it by 10 points, and then Joe Biden wins it by 2. And it happens every time. So I would watch it very closely, because Adam Laxalt is a great candidate, and Cortez Masto is not.
With a great last name. I mean, how can you not remember that?
Yeah.
That speaking of strange votes here and not being able to predict, that may or may not be the case with Wisconsin, which I'm going to get to. Wisconsin is a very interesting state in general. Back a while ago, Wisconsin used to be considered also a swing state, very, very, very much like Iowa. And so what we have for Wisconsin is we have the Democrats are trying to unseat. This is what I wrote in my notes. So Dallas is following one of Dallas's favorite people, and that's Ron Johnson. So Ron Johnson's a very interesting character, obviously, very collaborative. He's conservative, but also libertarian to a lot of people, and that's where Dallas gets his fandom for him. I think Ron Johnson's probably going to pull it out. It's going to be just fine. I've been watching a lot of the news around this, and the thing with Representative Johnson is that they don't really have anything to stick to him, right? There's not a lot of meat to try to take him down on a negative. So they're going to have to attack his policies, and it probably will not bode well with Wisconsin voters. It just won't. And so he's probably going to pull this out. Again, we're not here to make predictions here, but I think he's going to be just fine. But in the interest of Dallas here, do you have anything to say about your buddy?
Yeah, my buddy.
You talking about
Ron Johnson is I mean this lovingly. He's boring.
That's what I mean. They're not going to have anything to stick to him. I mean, nothing's going to stick.
They're going to throw January 6th at him up and down, because Ron Johnson has he's equivocated on some what you might call conspiracy theories, and they're going to throw that at him because that's all they have. And it's not going to do much because polling shows people just don't care. Democrats care about January 6th, but nobody else does.
And by the time that primary rolls around for the vote, it's that's a losing fight. Anyway, continue.
Do we know who is going to win the Democratic primary over there? Do they have a clear winner or clear leader?
We don't know yet. No, it's the thing with Wisconsin is it's like the Democrats running in that primary. It's too close right now, and they don't have, what is the date? They don't have it until August, right? That's when that primary vote is. So we still have time. That's the thing, is we have time. I think they're still waiting to see how he positions for his campaign. I think that he's going to run on policies. He's going to try to avoid January 6th. He's going to try to avoid some of the the right wing. You're right. He's boring. He's middle of the road.
Well, he's middle of the road in rhetoric, but I mean, he's not a centrist.
No, I know. And when it comes to policies, yeah, but he's going to have to run in the middle of the road. And what happened before was with all that from a few years ago, he kind of deviated from that. So I think the positioning of his campaign is that he's going to have to come back to the center and run on that. Again, they will probably, like I said before, attack him on policies, attack him on just maybe some of the Trump stuff. But
that's all they have.
But at the end of the day, like you said, there's really nothing there. There really isn't anything there. So
Wisconsin is weird. If I can just one more thing, in that most swingy states like Arizona produce candidates who drift toward the middle because they want to try to build that coalition.
Yeah.
Wisconsin is weird in that there is no middle to Wisconsin politics.
Yeah.
The left is hard left. It's where the American Socialist Party was born.
Right.
And the right is hard right. Yeah. They are rock ribbed Republicans. Well, and so it's very weird in that way.
Well, and that's why I don't think if they try to pin any of that stuff on him, it's not gonna work. Plus, the way he positions himself on a normal day-to-day basis is going to pull out the base that he needs to win, right? He doesn't need to float to the left in order to get Democrat voters out. He just panders to his base, stays clean, avoids some of the far right stuff, and he'll be okay. So anyway, enough about Ron. Enough about Ron.
We're so close to him. He's Ron.
Ron, yeah, it feels like it sometimes.
So then you've got a couple of odd states here of New Hampshire and Missouri.
Yeah, so Missouri. I'm going to start actually with Missouri. No, I'm going to start with New Hampshire and then end on Missouri because I'm actually from the Midwest, and so I'd like to talk about Missouri. New Hampshire, I actually, to be honest, didn't know much about it until we decided to do this. Okay, their primary is scheduled for September. Okay,
that's a late one.
So I highlighted that in the notes because of that very fact. So this gives candidates a long runway, right? So we're in April, May, June, July, August, September, and it's September 19th, I believe. And so
13th, yeah.
13th. Yeah, 13th. So midway through September, and then by the end of September, the October, then you have November elections in a lot of other states, including Texas, for that matter. So you have a lot of stuff going on. New Hampshire is interesting. I believe Trump won that state. Is that right?
He came very close.
That's what I thought. Okay.
New Hampshire is a swing state in presidential politics. It's what you might call very elastic. Okay, it swings one way or the other.
Yeah, so you got ahead of me on that. So yeah, so Trump did win that.
No, he didn't. He didn't. He came close.
He came close to winning it. And New Hampshire would be considered. I would consider it based on what I was looking at. It would be a swing state. We have a lot of we keep coming back to this word weird. We have a lot of weird stuff going on in the media in New Hampshire. You have it over there near other states that are making solid decisions. And what I mean by that is like they're kind of choosing kind of which direction to go, which is very interesting because what's going to happen I'm anticipating in 2024, you may not, I don't know how to say this without saying it, you may not have as many swing states as we think we're going to have. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think there's going to be,
we're going to get more dug in.
I think there's going to be definitive answers. And I think we're going to see that the closer, I would say if you're going to watch New Hampshire, I would say I wouldn't start watching it until July, late July. People are going to start solidifying positions right now. All the candidates, there's several of them, and we'll leave a list for you, and I can mention them here in a second. But they're all kind of trying to find out where they fit. That's kind of the problem and the issue right now, it would be very interesting to see if they actually, like you say, dig in and pick a side. It might end up being a swing. I don't know. It depends on what happens again with the presidency and everything like that. But New Hampshire is going to be interesting to watch. Just the simple fact that it could very well be a swing state, but if all these other swing states continue to sort of solidify in their position, it may not be. But right now it's unpredictable. I would say it's unpredictable.
Well, and it's one of the only real opportunities for Republicans in the Northeast.
Yeah, I mean, for the Northeast, yeah, for sure. Yeah. It's an opportunity. I can't say right now, and I went over this for a few hours this morning. It's an opportunity, but I wouldn't place a lot of resources in New Hampshire.
Yeah, I mean, Hassan, the Democratic incumbent Hassan, is not particularly popular.
Yeah, it's just, and the news around all the candidates, it's just, I wouldn't dump it yet. Now, again, I think once we get to July,
we'll have a better sense of where things
sense of it. So that one's kind of one that's, I'd call it like a floater, right? You just kind of floating out there. We'll kind of see. Again, we're a long way off. So some people might jump in, some people might leave the race. We don't know.
People are still trying to get the governor, John Sununu, to jump back in, because everybody had assumed he would run for Senate, and he said no.
I remember.
So we'll see.
So it's one of those where we're just going to watch. I think closer to July, we're going to have a better idea, kind of where everything is. So let's go on to Missouri. So I grew up in Kansas, actually about an hour away from the Missouri-Kansas border. Missouri is a red state, and very conservative, part of the Bible Belt. It's a beautiful state, actually, if I do say so myself. Sits there right there on the Missouri River, home to Kansas and Missouri. Missouri is interesting because it's gone through some changes over the years. People have, been a governor and then left for higher office. And there's definitely some changes that have happened. Missouri has always been kind of conservative. The family that I have living there have always been conservative. It'll be interesting to see how things change, though. And this, I think, and I know I keep coming back to presidential, but a lot of what happens presidentially in elections influence a lot of how some of the primaries shake out. And midterms shake out. So Biden obviously won the presidency. Missouri was still conservative, still red. That didn't change anything. I think it's going to depend on future midterms is what I'm speaking to, is like what happens in 2024. As far as these midterms are concerned, it's going to go conservative. We're not going to have to worry about that. Now,
I would put a pin on that one, because I think it depends on who wins the Republican primary.
Obviously that's the case, but I'm just talking primary, right? So,
but do you know about Eric Greitens?
I do, and so let me get to that in just a second.
I just want to make sure we were going to get to that we weren't going to write this one off, because we're not going to write it off. It's a potential whiff here, and it's.
I don't think so. So let's dig into the history. So first off, let me mention what I was going to mention, which is in August is the primary, right? So Missouri has a history of high turnout Republicans. They just turn out. They just turn out. And so I'm not writing it off, and I'm not writing your suggestion off, your implication off. But I don't think he's got a chance. And the reason I say that is because they always turn out. They always do. They always do.
So for those who don't know, Eric Greitens is a former governor of Missouri who resigned under a massive cloud of corruption. And it was a bizarre sex scandal mixed with bad governance. There was bribes. It was bad. He is running for the Republican primary for Senate.
Yeah.
He is leading the polls right now.
Yeah. Well, I don't, I mean, I could be proven wrong,
right?
But based on what I know about the people, now, like, I literally live there, right? So based on what I know of the people, we're talking about like evangelical conservatives. I would be shocked. And I could be proven wrong, and I can be shocked. That's what the best part about this, right? That's the best part. And so talk about being weird and being interesting to watch. All of these tonight have been all of that. Missouri is no exception, where if he were to pull this out, I'd have to make some phone calls. and there's nothing against the man, nothing against, but
oh no, I have something against the man. I mean, when you cheat on your wife and you use state funds to cover it up, that's a problem.
What I mean is the man running. Anybody can run.
Right.
You know, I believe in the process. Nothing against him and his ability to run, right? So I never qualified the statement. So, but if you run and you try to negate everything that you did, then and people vote you in based on that, there's a problem. So,
and just to be clear, for those who are watching, listening, what we're saying, and I don't think we said the quiet part out loud, is Eric Greitens has a committed voter base for whatever reason, and he could win the primary. And if he wins the primary, there is every likelihood he will lose the general.
Thank you.
And this is a seat that Republicans do not need to be defending. This is Missouri. It should be deep red. But we all remember Alabama when the creepy judge wound up winning the primary. And Alabama had a Democratic senator because even though we're in this really divided space, and maybe this is a good way to end it in this discussion because I know we're going long, even though in this really divided space, candidates still matter.
Yeah, well, in candidates' history, the historical reference really matters. Again, nothing against anybody for running. Go ahead and run. But if you're trying to run and avoid what you did, which, by the way, for those listening, the scandal was very public.
Yes.
It ended up being public. I don't think it was
right. Yeah.
It was very public. And now we're in a position where it's like we're voting on this guy. He is polling pretty well. But I believe, I say this all the time, voters are smart, and they always, in Missouri's case, they always turn out. But here we are. If he does win if he wins the nomination, he will lose. And he will
lose the general, you mean?
Correct. He will lose he will lose the general, and that should not be happening in Missouri. So, speaking of coming to some sort of a conclusion here, things are being shaken up. Mm-hmm. Things are in contention. Things that shouldn't be in contention are, and some that aren't. We have to, so there's all this stuff happening. And so what does that mean? What that means is that we need to pay attention. We need to pay attention to these. And we need to see where we maybe put resources, or we need to see where things change and we make note of. Because even though we love this great state of Texas, it's not indefinitely protected, right? There's going to be little factions of the state that change in very similar ways. Mm-hmm. Missouri is a great example. Arizona earlier is another good example, where you have deep red areas that are being shaken up a little bit. We're not necessarily blaming the Democrat Party. Some of this is our own doing.
Yeah.
Right? So in conclusion, watch these. And to list them again, we have Alaska, Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, Wisconsin, New Hampshire, and then Missouri. We had Vermont and Washington in there also. And we can maybe get to those at a later date. But those are kind of the ones to watch. And I will drop resources. The one that I really like is Real Clear, or Real Clear Politics. They have maps and all sorts of great data. The one that you used, what was that?
I use 270towin.com, and those are the numbers 270 and then the word towin.com. It's great. They have these interactive maps so you can see who's up for election. It kind of gives you its prediction on how close some of these are going to be, but then you can play around with the map and make your own maps. And I think it's really good for getting a feel for how these different coalitions work and understanding that, you know, in a wave election, it's not just going to be random. You're going to see all of the states start to drift in the same direction. And there's every indication that we're heading toward a wave election. So what I want to end this on, if I can end this on something, Republicans are polling better than they ever have in the history of midterm polling. And it is April. And what we know in midterms is that the closer you get to the election, the better the party out of power, so the party that does not have the presidency, does in the midterm. So the closer you get to it, the better the polling gets. We're already setting historical records. We have the opportunity to have some really great candidates in really competitive states. And we have the opportunity to force even some Democrats. See, the ultimate objective to politics, I want to end with this, is not for your team to win. It's for you to get done what you want to get done. And if we can force Democrats to cut spending, if we can force Democrats to feel so scared for their supposedly safe seat that they start taking our side on things, then we already won. And that's why I'm so excited about this, is you can feel the environment shifting.
Yeah. Well, and you know, to use a word that we started off with, is weird has meant several different things tonight. It's meant weird in the real sense. It's kind of strange. And then confusing, right? And then opportunity, right? Those are the three things, you know? And so, and what that really, all those three things really encompass is that things are changing.
Yep.
And they are changing in our direction. And they're bringing clarity. A lot of the change is bringing clarity to our positions and what we care about. In political political science, you call this a recalibration. That's what they call it. It's a recalibrating of parties. And I think both sides are finding their priorities and finding what matters to the voters. And Dallas is right. If we can be effective by proxy, we've won. And how we do that is watching these shifts and taking advantage of them. So in conclusion, it's optimism. It's optimism. And we will drop these links in the bottom. I'm going to do two other ones. One is actually hosted on the government website, and then one is Ballotpedia, obviously. If you haven't used it, go and check some of these people out. So go to some of these websites where the midterms are happening, and then copy and paste their name into Ballotpedia and learn more about them. Education is empowerment. It really is. And we hope that we were able to empower you in some form or fashion tonight. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you all.